All right, we're going to be talking about the matter of servitude in the Old Testament. A lot of translations have the term slave or slavery, and we'll contest that interpretation or that rendering. And as I have mentioned, if you want to look more closely at it, look at the book Is God a Moral Monster? And people, after I wrote the book Is God a Moral Monster, they said, you need to do more on Leviticus 25. So I've spent basically 3 chapters on Leviticus 25 in Is God a Vindictive Bully. So I'm kind of building on what I've done in the Moral Monster book, sometimes tweaking a few things, but also adding a lot more material to facilitate understanding the Old Testament. One of those new atheists, Sam Harris, said that slaves were treated as farm equipment in the Old Testament. That was one of the chapter titles that I took from Sam Harris. In fact, both Moral Monster, Is God a Moral Monster? Is God a Vindictive Bully? Those were taken from the verbiage of Richard Dawkins. So I credit him for giving me the titles to my books. Is God a Moral Monster? Is God a Vindictive Bully? So I'm using Richard Dawkins' language there. There is when it comes to servitude / slavery, a very helpful book to kind of give you a little bit of a picture of the history of slavery. You can find this in Nigel Bigger's book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, in which he looks at, he's a British philosopher, theologian, ethicist, and has just done a great job of looking at British colonialism and actually not just looking at the negative side, but also the positive benefits that it brought to many populations. People hear colonialism and think, oh, it's all bad. There's actually a lot of, there is a strong mindset of actually bringing the benefits of infrastructure, of judicial courts and so forth to other parts of the world. There's often a very benevolent motivation to making, say Britain, for example, making colonies. Of course, you all Canadians know about these things, and but so it's a very good, fair-minded book. He's gotten a lot of heat for this, as you can imagine, but I really admired the courage of Nigel Bigger to give a balanced perspective on colonialism. So I commend that book to you. But in his book, he says it talks about how slavery has been a universal feature of human history. The ancient Mesopotamians, Greeks, Carthaginians, Romans, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Incas, and Aztecs subjugated peoples and imposed forced labor on them from the 15th century onward. North America, with Comanches from the 18th century and onward, ran a slave economy. Muhammad, from the 7th century onward, slavery was common in the Muslim world. Vikings provided white slaves from Eastern Europe and the British Isles to slave markets in Arab Spain and Egypt. Raiders from Tunis, Algiers, Tripoli, and so forth enslaved between 1 million to 1.25 million Europeans in the 16th to 18th centuries. According to one estimate, Muslim slave trade as a whole, lasting until 1920, transported about 17 million slaves, mostly African, exceeding the estimated 11 million shipped by Europeans across the Atlantic. Soviet communism in its gulags or labor camps, 18 million people placed in labor camps from the 1920s until just after Stalin's death in 1953. Nigel Bigger says, talks about even in Africa, where Africans had been selling people to Roman markets and then to Arab ones. And then there were, quote, local uses, which included supplying victims for human sacrifices, which was a common practice in West Africa. In one incident in 1797, one report was that 1,400 to 1,500 people were sacrificed at royal funerals, and again, most of these were buried alive. That was the sacrifice. So this is a common practice in Africa itself. But Nigel Bigger asked the question: what aspects of slavery are simply evil? And he says that you have differing types of slavery, and they're not always absolute. That some can be laborious. You can have work that is soul-destroyingly tedious, without amounting to slavery. He says sometimes laborious work is performed under the terms of an unfair indenture or contract to which the employee has consented only under duress. Yet an exploited employee doesn't quite make a slave. Even, he says, forced labor can fall well short of slavery. There's nothing necessarily wrong with requiring members of a community by custom or law to spend some time of their time and energy on public works or in public service. So what then distinguishes slavery in terms of the very evil nature of what we would technically call slavery? He says that the slave is the slave owner's disposable property, to be put to whatever use the owner decides and to be bought and sold and perhaps even killed at will. That is the pure form or paradigm of slavery, and it is the treatment of another human being as absolutely disposable property that makes it categorically worse than other forms of unjust employment. And he said, again, reminds us, it's important to remember that historically not everything that went by the name of slavery lived down to this simply evil form. And this is what we see in colonial slavery in terms of what Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, said. She said, the legal power of the master amounts to an absolute despotism over body and soul, and there is no protection for the slave's life. And there's a common piece of Josiah Wedgwood, having this medallion. And there's a man who is on his knee in chains begging. He says, am I not a man, and a brother? So this is basically a plea that the slave is making to his superior. I'm a man, I'm a brother. Don't treat me as though I am disposable property. So what we want to do in our own session this morning, and by the way, when do I need to stop again? Remind me. 11:20:15. Okay. We'll give you the expedited version. What we want to do is look at various translations of the Bible, versions of the Bible, where we see slave and slavery. I want to comment a little bit about that. Then look at different visions compared to like the biblical vision regarding humanity and the ancient Near Eastern vision of the surrounding nations in their law codes and so forth. How do they compare? We'll look at the various provisions that are made for the servants in Israel, and even to try to prevent them to going into servitude, that there were ways of keeping them from going into poverty, which is a way of keeping you from entering into servitude. So the reason you go into servitude is because of poverty. And then we'll look at various texts that will perhaps unpack these issues. We'll look at some troubling texts. I go into detail on these texts in my Moral Monster and Vindictive Bully books, but we'll try to capture what we can here. First, let me say something about various versions. When you read our modern translations, you'll often see slave, slavery, and so forth. And this is unfortunate. Earlier versions, say in English or Spanish or Dutch or German, they had milder renderings of the word, say, the Old Testament word eved, sometimes translated slave or servant, evedim, the plural, which is sometimes just translated servanthood or slavery. That the modern versions are much, they'll just kind of readily plug in slave, slavery, as opposed to the milder forms like servant or bondservant or something like that. And so, a preferred, I think a fairer rendering would be servant or sometimes hired worker, because at the heart of the word, servant is actually a worker. The Hebrew word avad, meaning work, is basically what is being done here. And a servant is first of all a worker, doing work for someone else. In the case of servitude, it has to do with a dynamic dependency relationship with someone who is over you in some fashion, and so it is a term that is not intrinsically negative. A lot of times we read slavery in the Bible, and what immediately comes to mind? oh, that's negative, that's bad. And we infer a modern understanding of kind of colonial slavery, and we superimpose that on the Scripture. So it's often a very emotive term that is being that is generating this kind of reaction because of all these negative associations with modern day slavery. But think of how Moses and Joshua are both called the Eved Adonai, the servant of the Lord, in Deuteronomy and Joshua. But if you kind of compare how this is used, just as I said, it's a neutral term. It's not inherently negative. And you have to look at the context to see, is this a negative understanding, or is this a positive, or is it a neutral way of understanding it? And so you read in the book of Exodus, let's take that as a case study. The Israelites in chapter 5 are called Pharaoh's servants. Interestingly, Pharaoh's servants are also Egyptians. In chapter 5 also, 5:21, that Egyptians are also called Pharaoh's servants. Now, notice what God wants to do in delivering the Israelites from Egypt. Again, in chapter 4, 23, Moses, God is saying to Moses, tell Pharaoh to let my people go so that they may serve me in the wilderness. What's just happened? Again, projecting ahead. What will happen is that the Israelites will be delivered from the tyranny of Egyptian servitude, slavery, and brought into the land, eventually of promise. That there's liberation here, but it's rendered as being servants of the Lord rather than servants of Pharaoh. So it's a neutral term that's being utilized, but in one case it's oppression, the other case it's liberation. So that just exemplifies how the Israelites are going from one state of dependency to another. One is bad, the other is good. So that is just kind of a brief introduction into it, and I go into a lot more detail in the Vindictive Bully book. But let me move on very briskly to comparing the visions of the Old Testament law to visions of servitude in other parts of the ancient Near East. For one thing, let me just say something about the laws of the Israelites themselves, that there's a difference even within the Old Testament between laws and the broader vision. Laws, for example, don't always give you the idealized picture. When it says don't commit adultery or don't murder, this is not as though this is the highest virtue. Okay, I've avoided adultery, I've avoided murder. Well, that's, good, but it's not, to love your neighbor as yourself, to love the Lord your God with heart, soul, mind, and strength. Those are the ideals, but sometimes you'll have negative things put in because the law of Moses assumes that human beings will sin. In fact, the law of Moses, as Jesus says in Matthew 19:8, makes certain concessions to human weakness or sin. That Jesus says that Moses permitted divorce. Why? Because it was ideal? No, because of the hardness of human hearts. So although the law is good and holy and spiritual, as Paul says in Romans chapter 7, there are certain concessions that are being made, that it's not giving us necessarily the moral ceiling, but rather the ethical floor, as it were. Sometimes it's just a matter of regulating certain things, of controlling certain things, of keeping things from getting out of hand, even though it's not necessarily the ideal ethic that is being portrayed here. So God is meeting people halfway, partway, that he starts where people are and points out specific steps that will take them to where they ought to be, namely to recognize and step into the biblical vision that is articulated in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, where there is, first of all, fundamental equality between male and female, so there's no sexism, there's no classism, that all human beings are made in the image of God. So even though they may be servants, they may be rulers, there's a fundamental equality within the land of Israel that is assumed to be the case. That there is marriage between man and woman, that the standard for marriage is one man and one woman as one flesh for one lifetime. Genesis 2:24, and Jesus adds to that in Matthew 19, saying that what God has joined together, let no one separate. So there's a difference between some of those specific laws, which are not necessarily giving the ideal, and the broader vision, which is giving us the ideal, that of fundamental equality, no sexism, there's male and female equality, etc. So when Deuteronomy 4:6 says, keep these laws and do them, it says, for it will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this nation is a wise and understanding people. God meant for Israel to be a light to the nations, and if they carried out the law, they would stand out in terms of their practices compared to the rest of the ancient Near Eastern peoples. And this stands out, for example, as you compare the visions of the Old Testament law with some of the ancient Near Eastern law codes. For example, all people bear the image of God, Genesis 1:26 and 27 in Scripture. But in the ancient Near East, only kings had the status of the image of God. That they would put statues in their image. But as you read the accounts of even the creation of these ancient creation epics outside of Scripture, human beings are often an afterthought of the gods. In the Mesopotamian epic creation story, that humans are created from spit. So it's kind of a degraded look at human beings, or gods are created, the higher gods are listening to the complaints of the lower gods who don't want to have to dig these irrigation canals. So, okay, let's make humans to do the digging for these lazy lesser gods, and so forth. But again, this is, you see a whole host of contrasts in the ancient Near East comparing to the rest of the biblical laws. It's just amazing, the contrast in terms of how you treat a foreigner, how you treat the poor, how you take care of the poor by not charging interest, a high degree of interest in loans in Israel, but in the rest of the ancient Near East, no, you could gouge the poor and so forth. So they're kept in perpetual poverty. So as you keep looking at all of these, how property is more valuable than human beings in some of these other cultures, the Bible stands out. And so when we look at, I'd basically say this: if the law of Moses were being kept in the modern world, we wouldn't have had this phenomenon called slavery. And we'll offer some comparisons in just a moment. But another thing to keep in mind is that the Israelites were constantly reminded in the law of Moses that they were once aliens in the land of Egypt, and that this should inform how they treat the orphan, the widow, and the alien, the most vulnerable in society. So if you're looking at, I'm going to take advantage of these people, I've got, my law permits me to do that. No, it doesn't. God is looking out for the alien, the orphan, the widow. And so this will be very important as we look at Leviticus 25, when you have aliens who are servants in the land of Israel. Deuteronomy 10 says, show your love for the alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. Masters and servants are seen as being fundamentally alike. Job 31 says that master and servant alike come from the mother's womb and are ultimately equals. Joel 2, the Lord will pour out his spirit on male and female servants. So this reflects the biblical vision. You look at, say, ancient Greece and how, in terms of its own understanding of slavery, Aristotle said, not all persons are created equal, but rather some are slaves by nature. That's just the way you were born. He said, a slave is an animated tool, and a tool is an inanimate slave. A slave's an animated tool, and a tool is an inanimate slave. That's Aristotle. Some of you might be Aristotle'd by that, but that's the view that he took. So, in Israel's laws, we can talk about how there's basically a democratized, leveled understanding of humanity. There's not a hierarchy or stratification of society. The Israelites are commanded, look out, if your brothers or sisters, are doing this or that. Kings and priests are held to the same standard of the law as the common person is. And so we can talk about all these other things. But the David Baker, an Old Testament scholar, says it is characteristic of Old Testament law that the beneficiaries of this law are not the elite, but those at the margins of society. Very important to keep that in mind. Let me just mention a few things about the provisions that are made available to servants in the Old Testament. As I said, servitude typically came through poverty, and without poverty there wouldn't be servitude. But there are certain regulations that help keep things measured and tempered and not turning servitude into an institution. For example, impoverished Israelites would be voluntarily indentured servants for up to 6 years. But if they wanted to stay in the home of their employer, they could make it a permanent arrangement, as Exodus 21 says. There were gleaning laws in Israel where you could pick the edges of the fields where everything had not been mown down to harvest, but you could, like in the book of Ruth, you could glean, grain, or you could pick the figs or olives off of trees that they weren't to be picked entirely clean, but that the poor of the land could come and have some of that. Of course, they had to work for their food, but there was, and so they had that dignity associated with it. But there was to be a general looking out for others who were more poorly off. So there are also Exodus 22 talks about not charging interest to the poor, so that they become further and further indebted and can't get out of that cycle of poverty. So you don't charge interest for your loans. And Deuteronomy 15 talks about lending freely to the poor. When the poor are finished with their term of service, you load them up with provisions and so forth, and don't harden your heart toward them. There are also anti-harm laws. If you bring harm to your servant, if you maybe gouge out an eye or knock out a tooth, then the servant gets to go free without any remaining debt. Exodus 21, 26, and 27. So you gouge out an eye, knock out a tooth, the servant gets to go free. You can't just do whatever you want to your servant. I guess there's another way of looking at, knocking out the teeth, another way of looking at indentured servitude. But also, there is no right of return in the land of Israel. Foreign runaway slaves, get this, foreign runaway slaves from other countries around Israel were allowed to settle safely within Israel's cities, Deuteronomy 23, 15, and 16. That wherever if a foreign runaway slave is running from a harsh taskmaster, they're not to be sent back, but they're to be allowed to settle in Israel's cities. The Babylonian Code of Hammurabi called for the death penalty for harboring fugitive slaves. If anyone receive into his house a runaway slave, male or female, of the court, the master of the house shall be put to death. Also, if he hold the slaves in his house and they are caught there, he shall be put to death. So, I could babble on about this, but let me keep going. There are various ancient Near Eastern nations, Egyptians, Hittites, and Amuru, who had extradition treaties to return fugitive slaves. So that also have very harsh penalties for runaway slaves in terms of, gouging out eyes and maiming the bodies and so forth for doing so. And again, think of the fugitive slave laws in the United States in 1973 and 1850. There'd be rewards for returning runaway slaves because they were property. There are also anti-kidnapping laws found in Exodus and Deuteronomy, where kidnapping was a capital offense. He who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death. So very severe penalty here. And that was common not just in Israel, but also in the rest of the ancient Near East. Kidnapping was totally abhorrent. So it's, basically if these four provisions in the law had been heeded in the colonial West, we would not have had the troubles and concerns that have marred that particular era. And so Christopher Wright says that basically, no other ancient Near Eastern law has been found that holds a master to account for the treatment of his own slaves, and so forth. So he basically says this is very unique in Israel as compared to the rest of the surrounding ancient Near Eastern nations. Let me just mention a couple of texts. I was hoping to do a few more, but we'll just have to focus on. I'll just give Exodus 21, for example. Exodus 21, verses 20 to 21, and I'll read it for you briefly here. It says, "If a man strikes his female servant or his male servant or female servant with a staff so that he or she dies as a result of the blow, he will surely be punished. However, if the injured servant survives 1 or 2 days, the owner will not be punished, for he has suffered the loss." Now, some people say that you can, this is kind of the critic's argument. If the injured servant survives 1 or 2 days, the owner will not be punished. Oh, so you can just beat your servant to a pulp, and just as long as he doesn't die within a day or two, then you're okay. I don't know if you've ever heard that line of reasoning. Very common, but it's first of all a very uncharitable reading. And it doesn't look at, as George was saying earlier, it doesn't look at the context at all. I mean, notice how if someone's eye is knocked out or tooth knocked out, that person gets to go free. You can't just injure someone. You don't have the right to maim your servant. So there's that. But even before we get to that sort of a comparison, it says that if an employer, quote, master, strikes a servant so that he dies, he will be punished. The word is avenged. That's the word typically used for capital punishment. So it's actually showing, revealing the humanity of the servant who has been struck. So it's not as though you can just simply do whatever you want with your servant as property. There is a fundamental equality of life here, and you can be capitally punished. So it's not as though if you break a piece of furniture, you can be capitally punished. No. If you bring harm to this person made in the image of God, if you cause his death, you also will be put to death. So, and it also doesn't tell us what it doesn't mean that the person will not have, there will be a punishment typically associated with maiming someone, that there will be a penalty that goes along with it, but it's not going to be a capital punishment. So it doesn't mean that there is no penalty whatsoever, but it is simply that dealing with the case of, in this case, accidental death here. And this is indeed the context. There's just the verses prior talk about paying medical bills, and I'm not going to get into that, but basically, when it says that he has suffered the loss, the phrase actually means, for he is his silver, or that is his silver. And the question is, what is that referring to? Harry Hoffner, according to he's University of Chicago Egyptologist, ancient Near Eastern scholar, says that the word can be translated, that is his silver. And it's referring, the prior context talks about paying medical fees for injury. And so basically he's saying that the medical fee is being paid, and so the judge can have maybe take into account how the medical fee is being attended to by the person who struck his servant, to show that it was not intentional, that there is that is an overreaction, and that there was not an attempt to kill that person. So anyway, but it takes into account this. It's in the context of accidental deaths, and so it needs to be understood in this context. But again, more of that in my Moral Monster book. There is a more challenging passage, and I've got 5 minutes to cover it, which is. Should I do that? Okay, all right, okay. Because it's probably going to come up in the Q&A time anyway. So, all right, thanks. I can breathe a little bit more easily here and have a sip of tea. All right. Okay, so here it is. This is the text that people will typically point to. That this is they say, okay, fair enough. Israelite servants, they're equal. That it's just basically indentured servitude, kind of like when people would come over from the old world to the new, and they couldn't pay their ship's passage, and so they would come here after signing a contract that they would work for 7 years and then pay off their debt and basically be free to operate and get their professions going, get on with their lives in the new world. But what about these? What about Gentiles? What about foreign servants in Israel? Well, Leviticus 25 uses some interesting language here. So let's talk about that. But so I'll start at verse 44. So I'll read this through, and I'll pause and then keep reading. As it says in verse 44, as for your male and female slaves, servants, however you want to translate that. Whom you may have. You may acquire male and female servants, slaves, from the pagan nations that are around you. And it is out of the sons of the sojourners who live as aliens among you that you may gain acquisition. And so they may become your possession. You may even bequeath them to your sons after you to receive as a possession. You can use them as permanent slaves or servants. But it says, in respect to your countrymen, the sons of Israel, you shall not rule with severity over one another. A lot of people say, oh, let's see, what I'm gathering from this is you can acquire Gentile servant slaves. You can bequeath them to your children, and you can, some people say, don't treat your fellow Israelites harshly, but you could mistreat these Gentiles all you want. Oh, is that what the text is saying? Well, let's keep reading. Notice that these are described as male and female servants / slaves from the pagan nations that are around you, and it is out of the sons, it talks about the sons of the sojourners who live as aliens among you. So sojourners, aliens, that combination there. A lot of people stop reading right at verse 46. And then they say, look at how terrible this is. I say, keep reading, and this puts a lot of things into proper perspective. Verse 47, if the means of a stranger or of a sojourner, same people we've been talking about just in the previous verses, if the means of a stranger or of a sojourner with you becomes sufficient, or some translations say, if he prospers, and a countryman, a fellow Israelite of yours, becomes so poor with regard to him as to sell himself to a stranger who is sojourning with you, and so forth. It says, and he shall, and that there's a near relative, he can have redemption right after he has been sold. One of his brothers may redeem him. Now, notice what's happening here. It goes on to say that the person who is the Gentile servant / slave, who is in your midst, can actually rise to the position of prosperity to the point that he can actually hire, quote, acquire an Israelite servant to work for him. And it's saying it's not ideal, but it's possible, and that may be the only alternative that this Israelite servant has to, quote, sell himself or to contract himself to someone else to work for him because of his poverty. So this is a very interesting scenario here. And what I'd like to do is to make clear a few things here. That as we look at this situation, we see that there is a fundamental, similarity of language as we look at both how the Israelite is to be treated and how the foreign servant is to be treated. There's a lot of the same language that applies to both of them. So let me just give a quick summary here. I'm not going to be able to go through all the, everything in detail. But as you read Leviticus 25 itself, we see, first of all, that both Israelites and non-Israelites are called sojourners and aliens in the land. So it's interesting that even the Israelites are referred to as sojourners and aliens in the land that belongs to God. And also, Israelites, throughout the Old Testament can be called servants of the Lord, and so forth. So that's one thing. Also, both the Israelite and the alien may be acquired. The same word is used for both of them. You may acquire, servants from the Gentile nations, but in Leviticus 25:50, it says that the foreigner may acquire an Israelite to work for him. Again, this is contractual language that we use, for example, with our sports teams. You talk about teams having owners. You talk about teams having, trading players, buying and selling players, and so forth. And we don't think, this really demeans those basketball or football players or whatever. No, it's just a transactional, contractual language. For example, Boaz acquired, the word kana, same word that's used. He acquired Ruth as a wife. Or Eve in Genesis 4 says that I have acquired a man-child with the help of the Lord. Same word that's used. So also it's interesting that in the same chapter, Leviticus 25, you compare verses 49 and 47, we read that both the non-Israelite servant can prosper and improve himself, but also if there's an Israelite it talks about an Israelite who can also improve himself within coming out of poverty and so forth. So there's that possibility of both being elevated, whether Israelite or non-Israelite. And the Israelite and the non-Israelite may be in service to another permanently. The same word olam is used of the person who says, I love my, quote, master and want to continue in service to him for the rest of my life. That word permanently is used in Exodus 21, 5 and 6. And also the term permanently is used here in Leviticus 25, 46. Now, it's interesting. James Hoffmeyer, a noted Old Testament scholar, talks about how, when people say, you may bequeath them to your children. Now, keep in mind that there was, if you came as a foreign servant, and sometimes, the question is, how do you come into Israel as a foreign servant? Well, sometimes it might be through warfare, prisoner of war. Sometimes it might be that there are people who are trying to gain money in their poverty from a Gentile nation, and they might, give someone, one of their family members in servitude within the Israelite households, or sometimes people may simply ascend to becoming servants within, say, the royal household. We see foreign servants in Israel. We think of Eved Melech, who is a servant of the king, and in the book of Jeremiah, who is actually seen as someone who is a fundamental equal. But he is, again, an Ethiopian, but yet has a high status within the court of the king. We see Shebna, the scribe, who is during the reign of King Hezekiah, who is part of the royal household, but his name is an Egyptian name. So here he has an elevated position as service with the king. You have in First Chronicles, you have mention of one of Caleb's descendants who marries an Egyptian servant, and they have a Yarha, and they have a child Attai. But again, a very distinguished distinguished heritage here. But again, there is the possibility of intermarrying. And so James Hoffmeyer points out that really, as someone moves into another culture, you basically have to attach yourself to another home, because the Israelites can't acquire land. Unless you're an Israelite, you can't acquire land as a foreigner within the land of Israel. So you basically attach yourself to a home, a family, and work within that kind of a setting. And it is in that setting that you can arise and prosper, and maybe even to the point of having your own Israelite servant. But James Hoffmeyer says that basically within a generation, and no more than two, basically people are already assimilated. Think of Daniel, how he's in Babylon. He and his friends take on these Babylonian names. They learn the customs and so forth, and they're fundamentally, at least from a cultural point of view, they are Babylonized, and they are fitting within the culture, even though they still maintain their own Jewish distinctives. But there's this ready assimilation. Joseph, when he goes to Egypt, he takes on an Egyptian name, marries someone who marries the daughter of Pharaoh and so forth. So you have this kind of assimilation that takes place within, sometimes even less than a generation. So James Hoffmeyer says that generational sort of thing actually isn't even an issue. That there's a rapid assimilation to the host, within the host nation, where you learn the language, learn the culture, and basically you are fundamentally, say, you become an Egyptian or you become an Israelite and so forth. So these things happen very quickly. So there isn't that. But let me just say this about just the whole tenor of the Old Testament, where it is against oppressing the marginalized. And you read, for example, in Isaiah 58:6, it says, "Is this not the fast which I chose to loosen the bonds of wickedness, to undo the bands of the yoke, and to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke?" This is the spirit, the vision of the Old Testament, that there is not to be this sort of bondage. And keep in mind, too, that when foreign slaves ran away to find refuge in Israel, it was not as though, you can enslave them, you can do whatever you want with them. It is actually there to settle in any of Israel's cities, that you are to protect them, you are to guard them. So if foreigners, indeed foreign slaves, are to be regarded with dignity and respect and not to be taken advantage of, certainly Leviticus 25 is not going to be a text that says, but you can take advantage of these people. No, they actually have the opportunity to prosper and so forth. They're not to be kept in bondage. And so we have, and I can add this too. We can go on that. So whether you're an Israelite, you're not to be oppressed, or a foreigner, you are not to be oppressed. Remember, you too were aliens in the land of Egypt. So you 36 times in the Old Testament, you were once aliens in the land of Egypt. Remember your heritage. And so basically the underlying tenor of the Old Testament law is to remember your history and not to repeat it by oppressing foreigners in your own midst. Interestingly, too, that in Leviticus 19:28 it says, "You shall not make any cuts in your body for the dead, nor make any tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord." Are there any tattoo wearers in here? No. The point is not, you have to ask the question. Some people will quote this and say, "No, you're not. The Bible says you can't have tattoos." Well, what do tattoos mean in the ancient Near East? Some people think that this is a part of a mourning practice based on this particular text, Leviticus 19:28. Probably not. Cutting your body for the dead and so forth. Some people, a more dominant viewpoint is that it relates to idolatry or paganism. Like later rabbis would say that this is a picture of idolatry and paganism and so forth. But the best understanding of this is, I think, very significant. That it actually refers to the ownership of another person, what we would call chattel slavery, treating that person as property, that a tattoo mark is connected to slavery, being owned by another human being. Israel was prohibited from tattooing because of the degradation involved in owning another human being as property. So that is also very significant. And even if we look at it, let's just say, for example, that there is this distinction between the foreigner and the Israelite in Leviticus 25. Even though it does say earlier actually elsewhere in the law of Moses that both the foreigner and the Israelite are to be under the same law. So that's very interesting. But let's just say that there is this marked distinction between the Israelite servant and the foreign servant. Keep in mind that the trajectory of the law and the entire Old Testament is actually to bring Jew and Gentile together. That if this is anything, it's meant to be something that is temporary and not reflecting the heart of God, that is to loosen all yokes, to break down the barriers between Jew and Gentile. And so for example, Isaiah chapter 19, we read about how Assyria, Egypt, and Israel are all to be lumped in together as the people of God. It's not just the Israelites, but all of them are to be seen as God's possession, God's people, and so forth, God's inheritance. That you have, that Isaiah makes this clear. That in chapter 56 it says, "Let not the foreigner who has joined himself to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people. Nor let the eunuch say, behold, I'm a dry tree. Also the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord to minister to him and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants, everyone who keeps from profaning the Sabbath," and so forth. He goes on to say, "I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer." So this is the viewpoint, this is the trajectory of the Old Testament law, to go in this direction of making everyone who puts his trust in the Messiah a child of Abraham. And I'll finish with this. David Klein, an Old Testament scholar who recently died, University of Sheffield, he basically did a deconstruction of Old Testament slavery or servitude. And he talks about two remarkable provisions that really undermine any sort of institutionalization of, quote, slavery or servitude. He talks about, first of all, the extraordinary provision for runaway slaves in Deuteronomy 23 who come from foreign lands to settle in Israel. This fundamentally undermines the institution of slavery just in that command alone, that they are not to be perpetual servants or slaves in Israel, but they're allowed to settle in and assimilate and so forth. And David Klein says, what is amazing about the law of the fugitive slave is that it enables the slave to acquire his or her own freedom by the relatively simple expedient of runaway. A slave can choose not to be a slave, he adds. If a slave can choose not to be a slave, then the concept of slavery does not exist as it once was thought to exist. The same can be said about Exodus 21:6, where the servant loves his employer/master and freely chooses to attach himself permanently to the household. And so David Klein says, slavery is in a sense abolished when it ceases to be a state that a person is forced into against his will. With this blurring of the lines between freedom and servant or slave, the institution has lost its conceptual force. So these are some of the themes that we ought to take seriously. The foreign runaway slave can come and settle in any of Israel's cities. And if you're an Israelite servant who is being oppressed, you can run away and find another place to take care of your debt or your poverty. In fact, we read later on in 1 Samuel 25 where David's servants come to Nabal and they're looking for assistance from him to help feed David's men. Nabal says, who's David? Who are his servants? He said, people all over the place are running away from their masters. So he's saying that people are doing this thing as a matter of course. So you have a tough master, you run away and you find another place to locate yourself. So you have that opportunity both within Israel as well as a foreign runaway slave to coming to Israel for refuge. So you see that there is this fundamental concern for the dignity, the worth, the value whether you're a foreigner or an Israelite, whether you're a servant or a free person. So we see a really humanizing effect of the law in the Old Testament that is much different than what we see in the surrounding ancient Near Eastern nations. Anyway, we should probably stop there, but look forward to engaging with you during the Q&A time. Thanks very much.